So we can start.
Thanks everyone for joining, and today we have Ankush and Azyyati with us to share a very exciting topic, which is creating value through sustainable design. Ankush has 13 years experience and is currently leading a team of designers at PALO IT, and he finds joy in building something of value, which is of service to people. And about Aziz, she has worked in government sector before. She was a law graduate and a former public policy analyst who has moved to design thinking and is currently working at Palo IT as well. And together they will take us through the topic on how to apply sustainable design principles to improve our work and its impact in any sector. And a quick note about those who want to, uh, you know, by the way, Harris, are we having translation as well, simtrans as well?
No simtrans this session.
Okay. Yeah, so those who are joining, please keep in mind that do keep your microphone muted and also your camera switched off. Once the session is over, we will give you an opportunity to ask questions. You can post your questions in the chat as well while the talk is going on, but please do keep your microphone muted. Thanks. And Ankush and Aziz, please, you can start now.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that very lovely introduction. Can I just check that my audio is all good? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so we've done some very quick introductions.
The screen, maybe you can make it full screen.
Sorry, say that again, Harris?
The screen share is currently a bit small.
Okay.
You can adjust the size.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, better than before.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we all good?
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you for sharing. Okay, yeah. So thank you for doing our introductions. I think just a bit about me. Yeah, as the introducer mentioned, that I used to work in public policy. So I've always been interested in the bigger picture and how design sort of interacts on a systems level basis. So I think that's also led to my interest in sustainable design. Yeah. All right. Okay. So to start up the talk, we're going to talk a bit, I'm going to bring us back a bit more to the 1950s here. So there's this really great cover of, this is the cover of Life magazine, and it depicts a family throwing plastic into the air with glee, as you can see here. And the headline here is "Throwaway Living, Disposable Items Cut Down Household Chores," right? And so there was this sort of recognition by industry that at that time, profit really didn't lie in plastic's durability, which is what it was engineered for, but rather in its disposability. And, you know, if you think about today, fashion's very fast. We use disposable items on a daily basis. I think if you think back to the lunch that you just had, it would not have been uncommon to have, you know, gotten a takeaway container with plastic cutlery, plastic straws. It really is part and parcel of our life today, right? And And it's so ingrained, this idea of people as consumers. It's really important to remember that full-blown consumerism, as we know it today, it's really a modern concept. And it started in the 1920s, really started taking shape after World War I, and grew rapidly post World War II. And this is sort of the timeline of when this cover came out, and it's evolved to what we have in the year 2023. Yeah. Ankush, did you want to share your
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Azzy. And I think that this is a wonderful crowd we have. So a couple of thoughts on that, right? Sometime back we were discussing about design, and we are thinking how sustainability has become so much more important. And then this poster is really interesting. I'll share one link in the chat as well in a bit, which talks about how when World War was happening and just after World War, how the world was getting transformed. And if we think about the three circles of design thinking, we have seen them so many times. We talk about the feasibility angle, the business viability angle, and the user angle. Really, like before the World War, it was all about can you make something possible? Is it feasible enough or not? And we had this Ford cars, only black color. We had a couple of other things, just one or option available or one variant available. And then brands were thinking, how do we drive people to buy more? Because economies were tumbling so much. We wanted people to buy more so that economies could revive themselves. And that's what designers at that time really did. They designed products, services, and everything around them in a way that it became use and throw. So now everything which you see around yourselves, take the toothpaste, right? Why the thing has been designed in such a way? Why the outlet of the tube is so much bigger and so much smaller? Why now there are, like, for example, laundry detergents which are in liquid format and not the powder format? If you think about it, a lot of it is driven by design, but eventually to drive more and more consumers to buy more and more. So that's what has led us to the world today. And imagine if designers in those 40s, 50s, and 60s were doing so much efforts along with marketing agencies and businesses to drive that kind of a behavioral change. It has taken almost 50 years for us, or even more, to reach where we are today. And now we have started talking about sustainability. So it's like, why are we buying so much more? So it might take us, hopefully, much faster to drive this change, where we think about the environment so much more and sustainability so much more than what we're doing currently. So let's see what this session brings us together. There'll be some tips and tricks, and back to you, Azzy, on sharing how we'll make it possible as designers.
All right. Thanks, Ankush. Yeah. So I think building on that point that you made. So really at this stage, like post World War II, exactly as Ankush mentioned, design became a tool of consumerism. This is actually a famous quote by Tim Brown, who is one of the co-founders of the design firm IDEO. As Ankush alluded to, it wasn't just designers, it was designers working together with marketing agencies, working with business, to really drive consumers to purchase more frequently based on their wants rather than their needs, right? So just encouraging that sense of overconsumption through persuasive design. This is sort of overlaid on a rack of clothes here, because the fashion industry is actually the second most polluting industry after the oil and gas sector, and driven by the corporations in the fast fashion business. Does anyone know what this is? You feel free to put in the chat, or you can do a shout out if you want. Does anyone know the photo that we're looking at, or where this is? I think we're able to see any inputs on the chat. No clue? Okay, so it's like, that's good, I guess. So this is actually the Apple Store. Yes, thank you, Eunice. Yes, so this is actually the Apple Store on Orchard Road. And more specifically, this is the Apple Store at the launch of the new iPhone, right? And I don't even need to tell you which year this is, because basically at the launch of every iPhone, it pretty much looks like this, where you have consumers waiting in the queue, not necessarily knowing all the features that they're going to get, but you still want it, right? Because they've done such a good job of crafting that desirability of the latest iPhone. And this is often like this event and like the sort of mayhem around this, the launch of an iPhone, and that frenzy to get a new one is often pointed to as an example of consumerism, right, at its excess. Apple as a corporation has been planned obsolescence. So this idea that companies have a plan to make your gadgets obsolete even before they're manufactured. So they require frequent replacements. I think in 2017, there was actually a lawsuit against them, basically accusing them that they use software updates to slow down the performance of their old phones, making it very hard to repair. So it's hard for you to repair yourself or even use a third party. Yeah, so as Ankush mentioned, feel free to type in your questions or any comments. We will be checking it fairly frequently. So just to contrast that image that we just saw of that line outside of the Apple store in Orchard Road to the statistic that we have here from the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in that less than 20% of unwanted phones are recycled each year. In the Singapore context, where we love our gadgets, Singapore is actually one of the biggest producers of e-waste in Asia. The NEA estimates only about 6% of e-waste are recycled, and 25%, so a quarter of them are generally thrown out with general waste, right? So just thrown into the bin. Okay. So what is this reflective of, right? So we spoke a bit how like this is about done by design, right? So what we have today is that most products are created for the linear economy, where you extract the minerals or the raw materials required to make your product, whether it's an iPhone, and then it's then produced, so manufactured, and then it's consumed, right? And then it's thrown away. And then so you have the waste at the end of this life cycle. I'm sure as you may be aware, it's November 2023, there may be some issues with this linear economy, right? So let's start at the beginning. Let's take the example of the iPhone. So you might be wondering why I have a photo of an image of a chimpanzee or a gorilla on the top left. At the point of extraction, one of the primary minerals that's being used for the mobile phone is this thing called coltan. So it's a type of ore that's used in mobile phones and other devices to help store electricity. And the mining of this particular raw material, it's a major factor in the decline of this gorilla, the Gore's gorilla, where they've actually lost habitat due to this industry. And it's estimated in the last 20 years, 77% of its population in the Congo Basin in Africa has actually been lost, right? So they're said to be on the edge of extinction due to the mining of this mineral. As we move further up the linear economy, so we move on to production, the largest iPhone factory in the world, which is in China, has often been accused of having wages insufficient to support a family, social insurance contributions short of legal requirements, routine use of student workers. During peak seasons, workers are expected to work at least 100 hours plus overtime. The list goes on, right? Basically, not looking too good. And then as we go along, then there's the consumption phase, where more often not, these items are just used for perhaps a year, 2 years, 3 years, and then thrown away and disposed far before they've reached their natural end of lifespan. So it's a model that's less than ideal, and you might wonder what would be the alternative here, right? Is this our only way of doing things? Right. And also thinking through as our role as designers, right? So what is our role as designers in this? So Don Norman, considered the OG, the godfather of UX design, has a very specific view on this. Because everyone designs, we are all designers, so it's up to us to change the world. However, those of us who are professional designers have an even greater responsibility, because professional designers have the training and the knowledge to have a major impact on the lives of people and therefore on the earth. So he puts a very great responsibility on designers in a sense. Okay. So, we have this responsibility. Let's learn a bit more about sustainable design and understanding a bit more about this. If we look back to a very traditional definition of sustainable development, so this is just development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? So what does this mean in this case? Does it mean that we just use less things, reuse more, and then recycle more? And then just keeping aligned with that same sort of linear economy. And a lot of people have said that this is actually not enough, right? Albert Einstein is credited with the quote, "You can't solve the same problem with the same thinking that created it." And this is a really great illustration of shows, yes, you have the linear economy that creates a lot of waste, very wasteful. You can, of course, move to a recycling economy and then create less waste, but this is seen as being less bad, right? So you're doing lesser of a bad thing. Then we have this thing called the circular economy, which is sort of taking a wider view of it. And that's a bit what we're going to talk more about today. So in contrast, a circular economy aims to eliminate the concept of waste altogether. So you can see that the bin here is close to empty. Okay. Has anyone here heard of circular economy or circular design? Or okay, can't do a show of hands. Okay. Okay, let me just talk a bit more about it. So it's really built on the principle of eliminating waste from the outset, right? So eliminating waste and pollution. So it's designed out of the system. And what you want to do is keep productions and materials used at their highest value and regenerating natural systems. Okay. And following on from that, circular design is really the shorthand for practicing and applying the circular economy principles at the design stage of everything. So whether we design products or services and systems with a bigger picture in mind. So it's a future where we're not only are we zooming in on user needs, but we're also zooming out to consider the system in which we are creating. Okay. So if you just want to contrast that to that earlier image that I showed of the linear economy, so it's really taking like that tail end and just sort of wrapping it around and creating that circular loop. And this is actually called closing the loop here. So really what you want to do is recover the resources at the end of a product's life and channel them back into production. And the reality is that most things today are still designed using the linear model, right? So that means that almost everything needs to be redesigned in accordance to the principles of the circular economy, okay? A really good complement, especially when you're thinking about product design, is to think in terms of life cycle. So this thing called life cycle thinking. So you're thinking about the complete life cycle of a product. So in the case of a toothbrush, you think about the raw materials that it's made from. So it's made from plastic, made from petroleum, and the mining and process of plastic contributes to global warming, and which is of course very harmful, and the nylon that's used to make the bristles. During manufacturing, the plastic pellets are then melted into a toothbrush handle mold. The bristles that are made from nylon are stapled and secured to the core of the toothbrush and then trimmed. And then it's put into packaging, which is usually a combination of plastic and cardboard, which makes it very hard to recycle. And then it's transported to a store. And usually the recommended use for a toothbrush is 3 months. And at the end of the life, it's usually tossed into the trash, right? So with plastic, it takes around 1,000 years for plastic to disintegrate. So even though it's just used for 3 months, it will still outlive all of us given it's a non-recyclable item, right? So what you would be then doing as a designer would be to think through each aspect of the life cycle thinking, right? And how this can be done in a more circular basis. And in order to do so, it's very helpful to think of this thing called circular cycles, where you can look at the biological cycle as well as the technical cycle. In terms of the biological loop, so this is the orange side of the slide here. It's really looking at materials that can be composted. So biologically based or biodegradable raw materials are obtained from the nature cycle in the system, right? So you think of them, these materials they're essentially on loan from nature, and eventually the bio-based materials will be restored to nature. So something like toothbrushes makes sense, right? Because you only use it for 3 months, and then perhaps what you have today, like bamboo toothbrushes made from the bamboo handles, and then they can be then planted or thrown away, and it's biodegradable. So it gets returned to the earth at the end of the day. Technical cycles, which is on sort of the green side, they encompass man-made materials, so substances that are hazardous to environment. So a lot of these very rare materials that are in your phones, for example, it's very dangerous if you were to dispose of it and put it in a landfill, right? Like because of the raw metals and whatnot. So these materials originated for human activity, and then they can be used for different commodities. Because of processing, they've acquired a form where you can't really return them to nature. So with these substances, they should be circulated as efficiently as possible, and to limit the amount of new raw materials being collected from nature. So things like phones and cars, and setting up new ways of doing business where it's a subscription model, so you ensure that more people can use the car, for example, for a longer period of time. So it gets refurbished or it gets reused. Okay. And a really good complement to circular, in terms of thinking about circular design, is this thing called systems thinking. So systems thinking is essentially, it's really important in a sense because the goals of the circular economy, they require systems level changes. So you need to think of systems thinking is a way of seeing the world as a series of interconnected and interdependent systems rather than a lot of independent parts, right? So you don't think of the world as a sum of isolated parts, but rather everything is part of a larger whole, and there are connections between all elements. And that's really critical to understanding the way the systems and the world works at large, right? So for example, the production cycle of a toothbrush is a system, but it also interacts with other systems, perhaps like how recycling is done in that particular city. So just to again contrast sort of the tools as a system thinker, it's for example, you would tend to see connections between things that might seem disconnected. You would have a more circular view of things. You view things in terms of a whole rather than the sum of individual parts, and you would be able to see the synthesis between the disparate parts. Okay. Oh. So I think a really good example to sort of show where system thinking may not be used is in the airline industry. So where now sustainability is all the rage, in a bid to reduce plastic waste, some airlines have opted to introduce stainless steel, right? But however, if you take a wider view of things, you realize that metal actually adds extra weight, and that in turn leads to extra fuel burn, and that carbon emission is actually a bigger issue than plastic waste, some might say, right? So it's really important to not just look at a very narrow issue like, oh, we must just stop the use of plastic. You must realize that by swapping to a different material, this could lead to actually bigger consequences in terms of carbon emissions. It's also interesting to see how other airlines have approached the same issue. So this is actually by Air France. So what they've done here in the bid to sort of come up with different uses for their cutlery. So they've stuck with the lighter tableware, but they've designed it in such a way that it can be turned into toy airplanes in a way to sort of, in the hope that this would then extend the lifespan of this particular product. Disposal items are lighter, and that would reduce the carbon output from fuel savings, and that makes it worthwhile as well. And then they also look at how in not actually having to clean them, and in the disposal process, they can actually capture and recycle the heat energy. So they think about the end of the life cycle, where once it's disposed, they can actually capture that energy at the end. And they work with the particular vendors at the end, where they work with a French manufacturer, right? So they're able to reduce their transport-related emissions. So really just capturing that wider system, right, from all the different interplay of different players.
Maybe Aziz, I'll give a quick example, another one, and so that you also take a break. So yeah, we do a lot of workshops too, and that's another very good example. I thought I'll maybe narrate out here to the audience. So before COVID, we used to do a lot of physical workshops, and people used to say, "Oh my God, so much waste of paper." We used a lot of sticky notes, and at the end of a workshop, there's this whole pile of multiple flip charts, maybe A4 sheets, A3 sheets, and all these sticky notes. And then we moved to these virtual boards like Miro, Mural, etc., etc. And people said, "Oh, this is so much more sustainable," and we kind of believed it as designers too. Um, However, what happened very recently was when we have now gone back to having many more physical workshops, we were in a dilemma whether to now use these virtual tools or whether to use these still paper artifacts. And we did a quick study, and more than happy to share a bit more discussion or results around it maybe later on. And we realized actually there's so much more to than what meets the eye. So, for example, the PPT deck, which you're sharing to you, uh, if you want to take a guess, how much memory would it be taking? Uh, Feel free to again write it in the chat. You might say 10 MB. Someone might say, okay, it might be using a lot of imageries and multimedia, maybe 100 MB. Actually, one of these files on our SharePoint consumes sometimes more than 10 GB. It's unbelievable, but that's true. Um, why it happens? Because online they want to create multiple copies of it. If, let's say, I'm collaborating with Azi on this PPT file, I make one change, it creates a separate copy of that. Then Azi might change one more letter, it creates another copy. So the file itself might be 100 MB, but 100 people making changes 10 times a day, it creates so much more copies. And what we don't know is what's that 10 GB worth of online data consuming in terms of carbon credits. Because again, we are not able to see what's going on behind in those data centers. That's why you might have read the news now. Google is purchasing huge islands or underwater these data centers. It's burning so much more fuel to just maintain them. So that's exactly what systems thinking is. It helps us go just beyond what's meeting our eye. So we might say, oh, this sticky note is causing more pollution, which might be 1 3M sticky note. But actually, it might be much, much more sustainable than a sticky note on your mural board or a Miro board. So with that question, maybe keep that in mind. Maybe keep provoking yourselves or your team members. Ask your tech team, do you know the size of my files online? And is it so much more? And then ask one more question. Do you know how much carbon credit is that burning day to day or on an annual basis if it's kept for 1 year? And maybe that will get you thinking, what's better, a paper or a virtual file? Back to you, Azzy, with that thought-provoking question for everyone.
Thanks, Ankush. Definitely lots to think about there. All right. So aligned with systems thinking, a really good tool, because obviously it can get very complex to think about all the different systems your product might be interacting with, is this tool called system mapping. And system mapping is the idea of mapping out visually what your product interacts with. Okay, so we have this great quote here by Jules Hayward. Jenny, when individuals have a better understanding of systems, they are better able to identify the intervention points that leads to the desired outcomes. So going back to the example of our toothbrush example. So earlier on, we talked about the production life cycle of a toothbrush, right? So from the extraction, from the manufacturing to the natural life cycle, and then transportation as well as disposal. So here we have that as well, but also we looked at how it's interacting together with the user here. So we're looking at how it's being manufactured. Does the plastic manufacturer use renewable resources, natural materials? Is it coming from solar panels? When it gets to the user, how is the user themselves using it as well, right? In the bathroom, do they dispose of it via compost, or does the local council have recycling facilities, right? So just really understanding how is it interacting with the wider systems in play, thinking about it when it goes to the dentist as well, how is the dentist potentially distributing it to its patients? If there's perhaps a model where you send back the used head, how will they go about doing so? Is it just using the local post? And then are they reusing the old plastic? And once all of these different aspects, different systems are mapped out, then as a designer, you're able to sort of sit there like, okay, where are the different intervention points, right? Where does it make sense to make some changes? Really, after being able to zoom out and having an eye of the wider systems that it interplays with. Okay. So we've gone through a lot of sort of approaches and frameworks as well as tools. And I think a really sort of good point to also bring across is that there's no single way to design a product or service that creates no waste and pollution, or a business model that keeps products in use for years and years and years, right? Rather, just keeping in mind the principles of a circular economy leaves it open, right? That is open to countless strategies and innovations. Here are just some of sustainable design strategies that designers have used. I won't go through some of them, but generally things like longevity, right? So the idea is that you design products that last. So extending the life of a product allows it to remain in use for as long as possible. Dematerialization, so you design or you reduce the resource requirements you design, for example, by creating a digital rather than a physical product. But of course, thinking about the wider implications of that, as Ankush mentioned earlier. Modularity, right? So designing for upgradability and easy repair. So modular systems are easier to customize and therefore adapt to the variable and forever needs of users. So now there are new phone alternatives out there where you're able to just remove certain parts. So if you want to upgrade the camera, you're able to do so. If you want to upgrade the memory, you're able to do so. So it's not just, you don't have to get a new phone. Moving from products to services, so shifting from ownership to access. And we've seen a lot of businesses in Singapore come up with this new business model, right? So in terms of renting the clothes or your cars and so on. And you, despite understanding that customers only require access to a product for a short period of time, after which they can return it to the service provider or pass it on to a new user. And there's been, and we've really seen this in recent years. So these are just some of the sustainable design strategies. Okay. So in the past few years, I think we've gotten very good at human-centered design, right? So traditional design approaches place a very particular focus on considering and meeting the needs of the end user. But if we were to design for the circular economy, we need to look much wider than this, right? Not only considering just the user and of course the business and the tech side, but also the environmental and ethical values. And this is what's being termed responsible innovation. So by adding this fourth sphere, which talks about the circular nature of design, including the notion of resources, ecosystems, the ethics of it, this will then open up new possibilities for discovery and new economic, social, and environmental opportunities. Okay, so let's just recap our talk. So really, I think the key message we wanted to put across is that designing for sustainability requires a new approach. We need to zoom in on both the user needs, but also zoom out to consider the wider systemic implications. The current linear economy is based on extraction and exploitation. There needs to be a different way. So we now look to the circular economy, which entails redesigning products to be more durable, reusable, repairable, and recyclable, and keeping it in circulation for as long as possible. Systems thinking is an approach of seeing the world as a series of interconnected and interdependent systems rather than independent parts. And this is very fundamental for actioning the circular economy. So when Ankush and I first started our talk, we sort of showed that really great life cover design, right? Sharing how design has become a tool for consumerism. And I think in closing our talk, something that we would like you guys to talk about is what type of products do you want to design for? What type of economy do you want to design for? And I think that's how I want to wrap up our session today. Okay, that's actually our last slide. So I think at this point we can now open up for any questions that anyone might have.
Thanks, Ankush, and thanks, Aziz, for this interesting talk. And for our participants, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions directly, or you can post it in the chat. And Harris, if there are any questions from the live session, do notify me as well about that.
Yeah, no question from the live streaming as of now.
Okay. Okay, so anyone, any questions? Yeah, please unmute yourself and ask it here. Looks like there are no questions right now. You can also ask any questions to Ankush or Aziz. I mean, you can connect with them on LinkedIn and ask questions there as well. But right now, yeah, we don't have any questions, but I have a question of my own actually. Since as you were giving that example of toothbrush, I was thinking that in India we have this traditional, neem ka datun, which is like basically twigs of neem tree, which were used as toothbrush uh, uh, long back, not so much now. Maybe some rural people they still use it. So I mean, will it be good to say that maybe they had some better wisdom when it comes to product design um, compared to the consumer-centric product designers you were talking about, who came up in like 1920s or 1950s?
Yeah, I think that's such a great examples. I think there's so much that we can learn from traditional cultures where the culture was really you buy things or you make things and it's there for the long term, right? Or it's something that's from a renewable resource, which sounds like this traditional toothbrush.
Yeah, just a renewable resource in this case, yes.
Yeah, and like I said, this idea of consumerism is a very much a modern concept. And if we look to how companies were doing things before, they really took ownership of. I think a good example I can give is like the Coca-Cola cans. So I don't know how old the average age of the audience, but I recall a time when you would go to a store and you would get your Coke can in a glass bottle, right? So you would drink it, and then the company takes the ownership of bringing that back to their center, cleaning the bottle, and then return and then filling it up again. And so there was that circular cycle in terms of the packaging of the product. And so it's just looking back to see like this is how things were once done, and it didn't have that waste there. So I think there's so much that we can learn to prior to this age of disposability. And lots of learnings there, right? So it's just really tweaking it again at a systemic level.
Yeah, and kind of adding to what Aziz said, and a great question and observation. I think not just in India, like the example which you're talking about was even in US, which is now so much more consumeristic, right? Um, Even in US in the 40s and 30s, or we say, oh, West is now burning so much more. They were actually much more sustainable. People were using objects multiple times. In fact, when plastic was first introduced in the market, it's one of the most durable materials. So people thought, oh, one plastic bag can last me a lifetime, and actually it can. But because of the trend of consumerism, people started using plastic just for one time and then throwing it away, which was not its intended use, because and that's what drove the real trend of consumerism, saying that okay, we can also buy clothing for maybe one season and throw it away, and that's where many of the brands came up. So yeah, I think not just the toothbrush example, but multiple things around you. When you start asking the right questions, you will realize that they are not actually meant for one use. They are meant for multiple users. It's just the industry which is driving us to make them obsolete and saying we need something new. Interestingly, now if you search for neem toothbrush, there are so many brands which are now selling them, not just in India, but worldwide. I think there's Amazon website where I checked. There's a website in Singapore where we are based called iHerb, which also sells neem tooth brushes. They obviously have now modern takes, but at the same time, they are still available. So yeah, interesting times. And that's where it leads us to the first point, right? Uh, as designers, how much responsibility we have on our shoulders, we can change the world. And if we start changing it today, perhaps when we have our own children or in the next generation comes forward, they'll realize the behavioral changes which we have made today, because they'll come to life in the next 10 or 20 years. And not just these objects, but even look at applications, at the whole economy of I want it right now, in this instant. So we click on something and we want it right away. In a way, we never needed it, just that it has now become a necessity. So that's also actually impacting the world in a very, very different way. So how can we make smaller changes, or what we also sometimes call nudges, which changes behavior of people or societies or cultures around us, which leads us to something which is much more sustainable as a world with least wastage. In fact, we didn't go through some of the case studies. We are working with a very big luxury brand at the moment, which is actually looking at this, which is how can they make luxury more sustainable, which it should be. But again, people are now buying so much more, right? Like we gave the example of iPhone. Do you really need one new iPhone every year? Not really. But just that there is this thing of, I want the latest thing in my hands. I want something which is powerful, which is leading us to that wastage. So, as I said, it's a behavioral shift which we as designers can make it happen, which will go a long way. Thanks for sharing our LinkedIn profile. So yeah, do connect with us. More than happy to share more, have one-on-one discussions, or if you're working on sustainable solutions, more than happy to maybe give our feedback or inputs on how you can make it better. So yeah, glad to be part of this forum.
Thanks, Ankush, and
Hi,
thanks,
Ankush. Hi.
Okay.
Yes.
Jay-Z here.
Yeah.
So, let's say on a shopping app, have you seen any trends in terms of um, indicating, designing sustainability or sustainable products? I mean, they're selling, of course, but have you seen what are the trends that you're seeing when it comes to conveying sustainability?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question again. So I think all brands are doing it. For if we talk at a very high level, maybe for two main reasons. One is they themselves want to become much more sustainable. Secondly, maybe their regional policies, or if they are in EU, maybe EU kind of directives are forcing them to do it. So we are seeing it more and more. Some of the trends which you have observed, maybe I can go through a few, and then Azzy, if you want to add in. If you look at, for example, Zalora, which is a very well-known e-commerce app in Singapore, now it has an option of selling back or putting back your clothings back into the system. So now they have Zalora pickup points where you can actually give back your clothes which are no more in use. I think they then recycle them. Maybe if they are reusable, they clean them and sell them again in the platform as seconds items, or they make other uses of those clothes and other objects. And in the end, they are also rewarding the customers in their own ways. So Zalora is doing that in that ways.
Ankush, 1 second. I was just thinking in terms of the icons for sustainability when you're designing.
Okay.
What are the icons that signify sustainability? I know initiatives are there,
Okay.
but when we look at a shopping app at
Okay.
a very spontaneous level, what would stand out for me as sustainable? Is there any icon that is coming up, shaping this whole sustainability? As I was thinking more in those lines, in designing the icon.
Okay. When you say icons, is it the visual icons you're talking about?
Yeah, the visual icons, right. They
Okay.
have one for free shipping, one
Oh, all
for
right.
cashback. So I know for icon for sustainability is always green, but
Yeah.
is there anything else coming in terms of the trend? Have you seen anything across the globe or any icon that they're building upon?
Okay. I think again there are multiple iconologies which icons which are used in multiple instances. There are, again, the green one is very prominent and well known.
Yeah.
But there are also well-known now bodies which are coming up. So again, we didn't talk about another case study which we did work with. It's called CIX, which is like a customer carbon exchange platform. They work with, for example, gold and Vera standards, where these are the standard or kind of issuing authorities, which gives stamps, or you can say some kind of certifications to brands, which they can then put up on their websites. So I think, but if you're specifically looking for visual icons which can distinguish sustainable brands versus other brands,
Yes.
it's again not a set standard. I think it's an evolving thing yet. We haven't
Okay.
seen something which just stands out, except for the color green, which can also then send different signals.
Right.
Have you seen something?
So I think maybe just building that question, not so much on the visual icons itself, but I come to realize that our talk focused more on physical products, and I'm aware that of course a lot of people here work in digital products as well, right? So in terms of like digital sustainability, just keeping in mind how your technology and resources are produced, stored, and transferred in a way that they minimize negative impact on the environment. So I think some aspects to consider just generally in like the digital product space is things like energy efficiency. So when you think about it, like even though it might be a website, they still the digital systems and infrastructure for during the design and development and the hosting stage that still requires energy, right? Which has a very physical impact in the real world. And the way you optimize the design, their choice in your usage of hardware and software and the power generated by data center will obviously have an impact on energy efficiency. So you might want to look to reducing how you can reduce power consumption. Looking at your data practices, I think only about like 1% of the data is actually created is reviewed in terms of usability, validity, necessity, right? And a lot of data centers are filled with so-called data that are redundant and never used. So thinking about the data that you're collecting, right, whether you actually need it. And because these not used digital data, what people call dark data, it still needs energy for them to be stored, right? So responsible data management will promote this sort of validation and organizing and removing them once they're redundant. And I think a final point on that is to think about digital inclusion and accessibility. So sustainability is not just about the environment, it's also about people and society as a whole. And so you want to make sure that all people and all possible users can access your digital product equitably, right? And how you can sort of bridge that digital divide. So just for those guys in the digital product space, something to consider as well. Yeah.
Okay. So what comes to my mind is when we think of sustainability, there are different attributes that one can build icons upon, because that's my that's what I'm thinking about. So it could be reuse, it could be in minimum energy from what you're saying, right? We could indicate all these different aspects to denote sustainability. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question.
There is a question from our live streaming, and Kitty is asking, is there a common way to measure the value taken from sustainability design?
So I think again, I'll take it up. So we're working extensively with multiple brands, and sustainability is very wide and a very broad topic. So, for example, just circularity within sustainability might mean something. So what we are doing is maybe for each of those verticals within sustainability, we can map out different impact factors, and a lot depends on the business itself. For example, for fashion industry, the impact might be how much materials they are saving, which is not getting produced just because they are producing less or manufacturing less. It might be how much of these materials are getting recycled, how much are being repurposed or reused. Again, for fashion industry, they might be doing a lot of these events. So during events, what kind of impacts are they making in terms of, again, the impact during those events themselves? Some lighter touch impact measures from a design perspective also can be, are you able to save more carbon while doing common day-to-day transactions? So some companies, they are starting small. What they're doing is they are changing their travel policies to say, we are no more giving you a dollar amount of value to make the travel happen. Rather, what we are doing is we're giving you carbon credits as travel So now you choose, do you want to travel by air? Do you want to travel by road? Or do you want to just stay where you are and do a virtual call, which might take much lesser carbon credit? So I think those are different ways in which value of what we are creating as design is getting impacted. Now I'm talking more about these bigger examples, but on an app level, for example, we are creating something called Impact Tracker, which is saying, okay, if you have an app and it's doing multiple API calls, it's doing multiple things on the app itself, which are more technologically related, how can we measure the impact of those technical API calls and other abilities of the app itself, and say this is how you can minimize the carbon impact of the app itself. So yeah, those are different ways in which we are trying to see the impact, which I think your question alludes to, which is how do we measure the value of it all? And interesting, yeah. Just adding in, Kitty, because I think you're from Lazada, so it's also interesting, right? How Lazada also sells so much. Your sales are coming up. So how do you design in a way that people buy consciously, which is where design plays a real role? Again, a thought-provoking questions for us as designers. Obviously, we want to, people to buy more and more. That sometimes shows the success. But I think the new paradigm is how do we make them buy consciously, which is where also banks are struggling, right? They want people to buy more on the credit cards. But now you might have heard of apps like Doconomy, which is measuring the carbon impact of your purchases, so that you can actually set the carbon limits for your monthly purchases, which limits how much should you buy rather than recklessly spending. So interesting times. Let's see how brands like yourselves and even us building for other brands realize these differences in design.
Thanks, Ankush. Any more questions? If there are no more questions, we'll end the session for today. We are anyway nearing the time limit. So thanks, Aziz, and thanks, Ankush, once again for this great session. And yeah, everyone else.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It was a great pleasure talking to you all. Although we can't see your faces, but would love to connect with you on LinkedIn or somewhere, or if you happen to be in Singapore, meet you for a cup of coffee and chat more about these. Lovely meeting you all virtually.
Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.